Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Now let us recollect the other organs apart from these 5 main organs of the United Nations.
These are the principal organs under the Charter.
Yes.
The 5 organs and the International Court of Justice.
Yes.
Now, there are a number of organs of the General Assembly. The UNDP, to which I referred, is an organ of the General Assembly. The United Nations Fund for Population Activities is an organ of the General Assembly. So are the Children's Fund. It is called UNICEF because it was established as the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. That is the meaning of UNICEF.
Yes.
But now it's simply called the United Nations Children's Fund. It does wonderful work. The highest quality of humanitarian work, attending to the care of expectant mothers, nursing mothers, and children. Children are its priority. Then there is the High Commissioner for Refugees, which is also an organ of the General Assembly, and which is responsible for all these refugees and so on. Now, the difference between the Children's Fund and Refugee Organization is the High Commissioner for Refugees Secretariat is part of the Secretariat of the United Nations because their staff are seconded from the United Nations and they can move back and forth. And their salary is paid for as part of the budget of the organization. But the funds that they get for relief of refugees come from an appeal by the High Commissioner for Refugees and the voluntary contributions that come into it. Whereas in the case of the Children's Fund, all the funds come from voluntary contributions and the entire Secretariat of the Children's Fund is paid for by the voluntary contributions and not as part of the budget of the United Nations. I would refer to one more organ, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. That is a part of the Secretariat of the United Nations. It has a separate officer called Secretary General who is in charge of it. But the membership of UNCTAD is the same as the membership of the United Nations. The staff of UNCTAD are a staff of the Secretariat. UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Industrial Development. It started as an organ of the General Assembly, but in due course, they became a specialized agency. Now, what's the difference between a specialized agency and the United Nations organs? A specialized agency has its own membership. A member of the United Nations does not have to be a member of the specialized agency. And a member of the specialized agency does not have to be a member of the United Nations. For example, Switzerland is a member of every specialized agency, but not a member of the United Nations. I'm mentioning that distinction so that people can understand that these specialized agencies have their own membership, they have their own governing bodies, they have their own budget, they have their own assessment for contributing to their budget and so on. As you know, recently there was difficulty with UNESCO and both the United States and the United Kingdom withdrew from their membership of that organization. Recently, the United States has served notice that it is going to withdraw from UNIDO, the Industrial Development Organization. The major specialized agencies, what we call the Big Four, or the World Health Organization. I mention it first because there was an organization, Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, which preceded the World Health Organization. Then the ILO, going back to the League of Nations, the ILO was a creation, it goes back to 1921. It was a creation of the Versailles Treaty, and it was a member of the specialized agency. Then the Food and Agriculture Organization, it is called the FAO of the United Nations. It is a specialized agency, it has got a very large budget, very large staff, and its charter is, its terms of reference are to promote food and agricultural development. And then UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Many people confuse UNESCO with ECOSOC. ECOSOC is Economic and Social Council. UNESCO is United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization. It's not United Nations Economic Council, no, UNESCO. And that deals with education, adult literacy, all problems relating to education, culture and science. Those are its mandate. Education, science and culture. These are considered the Big Four. Then there are a very large number of absolutely specialized agencies, meaning thereby they deal with specific aspects which are technical. Telecommunications Union, going back to the 1860s.
Postal Union.
These are all specialized agencies, but they go back They antedate even the Versailles Treaty.
Yes.
So there are a number of these specialized agencies, there are 14 of them, but technically and purely, as we say in our country, naam ke vaste, the World Bank and the Monetary Fund
Yeah.
are specialized agencies of the United Nations.
They are also.
But they are under no obligation to receive any direction or guidance from the United Nations General Assembly or any other body in the United Nations. The main difference between the other specialized agencies and these two organizations, which are called the Bretton Woods Twins, is this. They have got weighted voting. They have got a share capital to which member states contribute. And the number of votes they have, their voting strength is based upon their contribution to the share capital.
Yeah.
Just like a limited liability company. If you are a member of a limited liability company, for sake of argument, any public limited liability company, and you contribute to its shares, you have got as many votes as you have got shares. And that is the arrangement of these two specialized agencies. They are doing extremely good work, and no one would want to interfere with them and their freedom of action. But they are very powerful agencies because their management is very tough
Yes.
and very strict, and therefore they are able to get a lot of money from member states because the member states know that any money given to them will not be wasted. On the other hand, in the case of United Nations, the general feeling is there's a lot of wastage and so on. I do not necessarily subscribe to that, but we must understand this distinction. So this is the distinction between specialized. Now, I might add one more thing, that UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, came into existence because at that point there was only a general agreement on tariffs and trade called GATT, and the socialist countries were not members of GATT. Today there is a World Trade Organization which is universal in its membership, and therefore the case for continuing UNCTAD as a separate organization is somewhat weaker. I was explaining that when there was only the general agreement on tariffs and trade, which is called GATT, G-A-T-T, there was a case for UNCTAD because the socialist countries were not members of GATT. Now, GATT's role has been taken over by the World Trade Organization, and it's universal in its membership. The World Trade Organization has got the right to hear complaints about fair trade, for example. For example, the United States legislature, this Republican-run legislature, might pass some extremely foolish measures, like, for example, prohibiting investment in Cuba or prohibiting dealings with countries which have any relationship with Iran and things like that. Now, those things might be illegal under the World Trade Organization Charter. So the countries have the right to appeal to the World Trade Organization in terms of fair and free trade. That is the object of the World Trade Organization, to establish conditions under which international trade shall be fair and free. That is the object. Now, UNCTAD has no longer a specific role in terms of these areas, but there are certain areas still where the World Trade Organization is not concerned. For example, balance of payments, invisibles, tourism and so on. There might be a case for UNCTAD, but my own guess is before long, when people start aiming for retrenchment and reduction of staff and so on, at some point the axe might fall on UNCTAD. That's possible.
Now, within the World Trade Organization, the group of 77 and group 7, group 15, what are these?
That is in UNCTAD.
UNCTAD.
There is no such grouping in the
World Trade Organization.
World Trade Organization.
But now UNCTAD is now over, now taken the place of
No.
World Trade Organization.
World Trade Organization and UNCTAD are existing side by side.
Side by side.
What I am trying to say is, before long, people will feel that that UNCTAD is a fifth wheel to your coach.
Yeah, that's
and they might do without it. That's what I am afraid of.
Right. Okay, then we shall get on to the next important thing, because we have covered more or less very major aspects of the United Nations organization, like development and then the charter and all these things. But I think one important area we have to cover, that disarmament, which is one of the important mandates given by the charter to the United Nations. Sir, please tell something about what kind of progress has been made, what are the efforts made towards general disarmament, nuclear disarmaments, or total disarmaments, whatever it is, and the present CTBT, there's a lot of controversy about that. So what are the achievements of the United Nations in this area of disarmament?
The area of disarmament, the achievements of the world community,
Yes.
rather than the achievements of the United Nations, because many of these treaties were negotiated outside the United Nations. Even now, as you will notice from reading about this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CD, the Conference on Disarmament, is to report to the General Assembly.
Yeah.
It is not subordinate to the General Assembly. It's not an organ of the General Assembly. You must remember that most of these discussions on disarmament have taken place in Geneva in a separate body outside the United Nations. Because if it is a United Nations General Assembly, every member of the United Nations is entitled to have a say. Now they are talking about sending this so-called draft treaty to the United Nations General Assembly.
Yeah.
Then it will come before it. Very often what they do is they agree upon the terms of a convention, say. For example, there's a convention on the abolition or prohibition and abolition of chemical and biological weapons. Now, all countries are supposed to sign that convention. There is no law that can compel anybody to sign any convention. But a convention is not a declaration.
Yes.
A convention has legal force, and when a government has signed it with proper authority, for example, I say proper authority, all conventions have to be ratified by the Senate of the United States before the United States can sign that convention.
Yeah.
The Convention on Genocide was languishing for 30 years before the Senate, in its wisdom, allowed the United States to be a party to the Convention on Genocide. I'm mentioning this in passing.
And also law of the seas.
The law of the sea is another legislation to which member states, it's open for signature, but only when member states sign the law of the sea treaty, they become parties, states parties to the treaty. It's a treaty organization. So the disarmament progress has been spotty, but has basically taken place outside the United Nations, and then the report is placed before the United Nations. As you will recall, in 1962, Rajaji led a group of people to plead for complete ban on testing. The result of that kind of pressure was the limited test ban treaty of 1963. Now that treaty was signed in Moscow by three powers: United States, the Soviet Union, and UK.
Yeah.
France did not sign it, and China did not sign it, and they continued to have testing in the atmosphere, which is banned by the treaty even as late as 1 year ago. Now, that treaty was placed before the General Assembly of the United Nations for information.
Just for information.
It was not for ratification, but for information. Similarly, they are now talking about a different procedure for this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but it's not for us to deal with it in the limited space and time that's available to us. So, in disarmament, very considerable progress has been made. But that progress has been made because of the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War has led to a situation where there is no longer any fear of a nuclear holocaust. The two superpowers have to a very large extent reduced the level of their armaments because they had enough armaments to blow up each other 20 times over. Now, a man can die only once. If you are in a position to blow up another country once or twice, that's quite enough. So they have reduced the level of nuclear armament, but not the capacity to destroy each other. That capacity still exists, and they want to keep it for all practical purposes. The negotiations in regard to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty shows that these countries, the nuclear powers, want to keep that as a deterrent for the time being at any rate. That's why they are not willing to submit to any timetable when all nuclear armaments will be destroyed and the world can go back to say 1940 when there was no nuclear armament anywhere in the world. So most of the progress, and it's been very considerable, has taken place outside the United Nations, but the first committee of the General Assembly deals every year with all problems relating to disarmament. People express their views, they pass resolutions urging the nuclear countries to give up their nuclear arms and so on, you see. As I pointed out in my book, Rajaji was fond of saying, when you have got so many resolutions in the General Assembly, you should expel any member state that does not observe these recommendations. And I explained to him, Rajaji, if we did that, we would be in a very happy position, we would have no members left.
That's right. Yes.
So much for disarmament. Progress has been made, progress still remains to be made, and there will be no end to this progress until there is a complete stoppage of nuclear weapons.
It's an ongoing process.
That is probably 20-30 years ahead of us.
Then something about decolonization, sir. How many countries have become independent because of the intervention of the United Nations? And had you anything to do with some of those cases?
Well, I would say that I was very fond of referring to the 3 Ds in the United Nations: disarmament, decolonization, and development. To some extent, we have dealt with disarmament and development, but decolonization is one of the major achievements of the United Nations. You may remember we were discussing how do you say that the United Nations is different from the League of Nations, which you characterize as a status quo organization.
Yes.
And I tried to explain to you that the United Nations has been a major instrument of peaceful change. And nowhere is this more in evidence than in decolonization. We had 51 member states in 1946. Today we have only 81. Of these 130 member states, probably 100 are former colonies. At the time when the charter came into existence, 700 million people were under the yoke of colonialism. Today there are hardly 700,000 if you leave out Hong Kong and Macau. These are very big, very populous states, but they are due to become part of China in the very foreseeable future. And this has been brought about, in my judgment, by the continuing pressure in the United Nations, especially by the Committee of 24, as it was called, the Decolonization Committee, which went on pressing these countries to give up their colonial territories. In fact, there was always a proposal in that committee that Puerto Rico must be declared independent of the United States. The Puerto Ricans don't want independence. They want to be very much a commonwealth of the United States. You see. But these people are saying you should be independent. And the Puerto Ricans said, thank you very much. We are very happy as we are. So that is the situation so far as decolonization is concerned. It is a success story. But on the same note, I might add very quickly, the Special Political Committee of the United Nations had responsibility for dealing with apartheid and racial discrimination in any form. And the result of that pressure has been, you have seen today, that you have got Nelson Mandela as the president of South Africa. 10 years ago, would you have imagined that? This has been brought about by the continuing pressure of the United Nations. The United Nations does not have an army, it does not have an air force. What it has is the force of public opinion. And when you can canalize that force of public opinion towards a certain goal, over a period of time, it has some effect. This is true of the Tasman Treaty, it is true of colonialism, decolonization, it's true of apartheid.
Then the other major question I would like, what about India's role in the United Nations, whether in disarmament or decolonization or peacekeeping? What kind of role India has played? Is it appreciated at this level, or any suspicion about India's intentions about all these things? Could you tell us something about special, because we must know something about the India, how it has influenced the decisions and the outcome of the United Nations activities?
I would like to speak as an international civil servant and not as an Indian, because what I am saying is completely impartial and can be substantiated. No country has played a more important role in the United Nations in various fields. Decolonization, for example, nuclear disarmament, apartheid, ending of apartheid, than India has. India was the leader in every one of these committees in the General Assembly. When it came to discussion, putting forward very helpful resolutions, directing the debate towards certain positive conclusions and so on. That's all that India could do, because we have no means of telling any country, give up your colonial territories. But that happened, and India was one of the leaders, forefront of that movement. In the case of apartheid, India was the principal force which was pressing for the abolition of apartheid, one of the leaders of that movement in the Special Political Committee. So far as peacekeeping is concerned, in my book I have said there has been no major peacekeeping operation where India has not had a role. In fact, I have said India's role is like that of the mythical Irishman who saw two people quarreling in the street, and he went up to them and he said, is this a private quarrel or can I also join? We have joined in every peacekeeping operation. In some peacekeeping operations where we have not sent our own forces, we have given commanders, we have given staff officers and so on to help. So India's role is a very important role in the United Nations. And I might go one more step when we are talking about the expansion of the Security Council. They are talking about various formulas and various possibilities, but one thing is clear in my own mind. If there is any expansion of the membership of the Security Council amongst the what we call the permanent members, whether with or without the veto, there can be no such expansion with just Japan and Germany and leaving out India. That is not possible in my judgment.
There are certain public perceptions about United Nations organizations. First of all, they think that it is not much different from the League of Nations. You already touched upon it. But my one specific question is that the United Nations is operating within the existing global political system, namely based upon sovereign, exclusive sovereign nation states, independent sovereign nation states. Now, one of the limitations of the United Nations perhaps is this fact. And can United Nations do something about changing this global system, which is based upon, in other words, I am asking the question whether national sovereignty is still a very important, relevant force, or whether it is going to be changed in course of time because of United Nations organization.
The day that you can go to Delhi and persuade Devagowda and Shankar Dayal Sharma to give their sovereignty over India and make it subject to the United Nations, that will be the day. You realize how unrealistic that is.
Yes. But at the same time, one of the reasons why the countries are very particular about their own sovereignty and maintaining their own weapons and the balance of weapons and all these things, mainly because there is no international security system which can ensure independence and freedom of the smaller nations. So, is it not time now for United Nations to think about having its own force, so that wherever there is a threat to small countries, its sovereignty, the United Nations can take decision and act?
So we are talking about something different.
Yeah.
When any member state, any sovereign state, signs the Charter of the United Nations, to that extent its sovereignty is reduced, because there are certain obligations of membership which are freely accepted by a sovereign state when it becomes a member, and that includes the provisions of Chapter 7 of the Charter relating to the Security Council. You accept that. You accept the authority of the Security Council when you accept that.
So already there is a kind of reduction in sovereignty. Because of this commitment of their own volition, they have accepted to abide by the security resolutions. To that extent.
But to talk about a world government where there is someone sitting in New York and giving directions to India and Pakistan, that is out of the question for the next 1,000 years, in my judgment. You might have, the composition of sovereign states might change. For example, perish the thought, India might become 20 independent sovereign states, just as the 15 Soviet members of Union of Socialist Republics became 15 different republics.
Yes.
That is a different situation. But for any country to give up its sovereignty in terms of accepting some other legislature or executive authority over its citizens, in my judgment, is out of the question. Out of the question. Let me complete, since you asked me that question. Now, when we consider what can be done to protect the interests of small country, this membership explosion, population explosion in membership, is due to the fact that somehow or other a small country feels its belonging to the United Nations to some extent is a guarantee of its sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity. It is not necessarily so, but that's the perception that makes them apply for membership to the United Nations. There is a world community. We are far from having a United Nations force which can march all over the world. That proposal has been made. It has not been accepted so far. I don't see its acceptance in the immediate future. It is possible that you can have a corps which can be deployed at short notice to a trouble spot to keep the peace. It is like having our border security force or something like that. It's not an extraneous body. But we are far from a situation where you can send the United Nations force and put down an invasion by some other country and so on. We are far from that stage. But today, that possibility is more remote than it was even 10 years ago.
So then the other public image about this is that United Nations is very effective against small powers. But when it comes to the question of big powers, it is not so effective. What is the reason, or is it a correct perception, or is something wrong with that?
The perception is probably valid. See, the situation is like this. Take, for example, Vietnam. The United States was involved in Vietnam. It was never brought before the Security Council. It was not brought before the Security Council. There was not an attempt to pass a resolution of the Security Council calling for a political solution, which was a very simple thing to do. It never came before Security Council. On the other hand, when you have any kind of, what shall I say, attempt to invade a particular country or something like that, the Security Council does get involved and so on. You may remember not so long ago, Turkey invaded Cyprus and created a small enclave, Turkish enclave.
Yeah.
That has not been recognized by any other country except Turkey. But it's a fact, it still remains there. Those are the exceptions. But by and large, there has not been a situation where a major power has gone into a country, invaded it and occupied it, like Manchuria in Japan and Abyssinia, Ethiopia and Italy, or for that matter the occupation of the whole of Europe, Central Europe by Germany.
Yeah.
Such a situation has not arisen in the history of the United Nations. To that extent we might give credit to the existence of the organization.
Such major operations from the big countries, mainly because of United Nations. The presence is there.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
The two are two separate facts.
Oh, yeah.
We have got the United Nations, these things have not happened.
Yes.
You may assume that the presence of the United Nations has acted as a deterrent.
Yeah, deterrent. Then the other important, many people think that United Nations is nothing but foreign policy instrument of America, so trying to subserve interests of Americans, national interest and all that.
The problem with the United Nations is every country tries to do the same thing. Every country would like to use the United Nations to get a decision or a recommendation which is in line with its own interests. And to that extent, the United States has every right to try to use the United Nations in that way. But if a General Assembly resolution is passed, it has to be passed by a majority of 181 members.
Yeah.
In other words, if it's a simple majority, 92 countries, or number of countries present and voting, they should vote in favor of a resolution. If the United States can persuade 92 countries to do that, there is nothing wrong with that. But in the Security Council, the United States is now really pushing very hard, twisting arms, trying to make the Security Council bend to its will. It is not succeeding to the extent it would like to see. For example, the declaration that they would veto any extension of the term of the present Secretary General, Boutros Ghali. That is absolutely wrong. The issue has not come before the Security Council. Then you can use your veto. There is no need for it to declare, we are going to use our veto. Who wants to know that? Very recently there was an article in the Indian newspapers saying that there was an attempt by the United States to put the extension question before the Security Council. It was turned down. It will not be considered in the month of August. It will not be considered in the month of September. It will not be considered in the month of October. It will be considered late November because the President Secretary's term goes on to 31st December.
Yeah.
The reason for that is the United States itself might sing a different tune after the elections are over. Because unfortunately this has become a part of the political controversy in the United States. The election is on the 1st of November. After that we'll have a different story.
And then there is a lot of talk about new world order, new international economic order. What kind of guidance or what kind of influence the United Nations can exert on the evolution of this new world order? I think we hear mainly about this new world order, we always understand in terms of American concept. They want to use this to maintain their own supremacy and defend their own national interests all over the globe. But what is the understanding of the United Nations with regard to this new world order or new international economic order?
So far as the new international economic order is concerned, this was very much the subject of discussion in the 70s. And in a recent article I wrote, people had said the new international economic order is an idea whose time has come. And I wrote, it is an idea whose time has come and gone. Because they could have got a very good charter of economic rights and responsibilities of the major countries. But the whole thing was spoiled by the insistence of the smaller countries to make the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and the Monetary Fund, subordinate to the General Assembly. At that point, the issue became dead. Now I might say developing countries are masters of the art of cutting their own noses to spite their faces. I was responsible for setting up an organization for cotton development in its own small way. We had promise of a lot of help from the World Bank and the United States. But the developing countries wanted price control and price regulation, minimum prices and so on as part of the deal. That was not the idea at all. It was for the development of cotton, because cotton is threatened by a number of synthetic substitutes. The idea was to replace, to sort of ensure the supremacy of cotton as the fabric of first choice, and also to improve the production of cotton, to deal with the various pests to which the cotton plant is subject and so on. All that went by the board because of the insistence of the developing countries especially the Turkish member who wanted the sun and the moon and the stars, and that came to a natural end. And I gave up my responsibilities as Secretary General of that Cotton Development Initiative. So that was what happened with the economic order. Now, if you are talking of a new world order, on the political side, what the United States would like to see is they would like to wield the soft stick, you see, not the hard stick but the soft stick, but have its influence in every part of the world. Now they are the major military power in the world today, without question. They are only superpower left actually. They are the major economic power in the world, although probably Japan and Germany together will probably exceed their national product. But they don't want to have a very visible, what shall I say, profile, a visible profile in that regard. They would like to do it from behind the scenes, and they will continue to do that. It's within their rights. I mean, every country has the right to do that. So far as India is concerned, we are the preeminent country in South Asia, and our role has to be primarily in South Asia in the first instance, and later on, as the largest democracy, functioning democracy in the world, our influence should be available to all developing countries, which it is. But so far as India is concerned, we are dealing with a different kind of influence. In the case of the United States, the influence is very powerful. It is military, it is economic, it is political, and the United States, when it wants its own policy to be approved, as for example, in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, they will twist arms as much as the Soviet Union used to do in the olden days with regard to its own allies and friends.
So decline of Soviet Russia has done a lot of change to the United Nations functioning, I think, because the American domination has increased after Russia has disintegrated.
Yes. The demise of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has led to two good results. The end of the Cold War and what is called the peace dividend, because those countries which had to have armaments as a protection against the Soviet Union, they don't have to do that anymore. And Russia has become not a superpower but a major power. It's not today very much more powerful than France, United Kingdom. As you saw, they have not been able to put down this rebellion in a small enclave in Chechnya. You see. They don't have the military strength even to do that. But the end of the Cold War also means that the fear of a nuclear holocaust and the fear of a nuclear confrontation has very much receded into the background, and that's a very important development on the positive side.
Now, one last question about the Charter starts, "We the people of the United Nations" itself. That means envisages a world community. And is it possible for such a world community to emerge in the near future? And if so, many people are of the opinion that the work of special agencies and also some educational effort on the part of United Nations, that will go a long way in creating the sense of world community. I think we cannot have a kind of a new world order without a new world community in existence. So would you say that in your book, I think the work of these development agencies, social agencies, it is going to be much more valuable in make contribution to the emergence of world community, and also regional organizations? These can do a lot to promote this sense of world community. Am I correct in drawing that inference?
We are talking about two or three different things.
Yes.
First of all, we are talking about the regional institutions. Now, there are regional organizations, the United Nations itself, the Regional Economic Commissions, for example. But there are also regional arrangements envisaged in the Charter as a part of the Charter. And these are the Organization of American States, meaning Latin American countries, the Organization of African Unity, the League of Arab States, things like ASEAN and so on, you see. Let us leave out military alliances like NATO, Warsaw Pact and so on. They are not concerned with that. They are not part of the United Nations system. The specialized agencies have a very important role to play in the economic and social development field. The specialized agencies have a very important role to play in the economic and social development field, and particularly, for example, in dealing with epidemics like smallpox, cholera, AIDS and so on. The World Health Organization has done wonderful work which is recognized the world over. But that cannot contribute to this world awareness of the commonness of the human community. That is what the Charter says. It says, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, are uniting together for these common objectives and so on. The peoples of the United Nations, for them to have a common sense of belonging to a much larger community than India, the United States or Pakistan or whatever, for them to feel we are a member of the human race, all of us. And we have that common allegiance to those objectives which transcend national frontiers and so on. That is the task of education in the 21st century. The Charter of the UNESCO says, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men the defenses of peace must be constructed. I will also say, since a global consciousness must begin in the minds of men, and for that matter women and children, it is in the minds of men and women and children by education that the concept of a global community has to be developed.
To conclude, I would say that we have been very fortunate in listening to a person who is almost a typical representative of Plato's man of happy versatility. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words.